In the spring of 1241, Europe still believed distance could protect it. Beyond the forests of Poland and the frozen rivers of Ruthenia, stories traveled westward in fragments. Burned monasteries, empty cities, horsemen appearing out of winter fog, entire kingdoms erased before neighboring rulers even understood a war had begun. Most dismissed the reports as exaggerations born from panic. Europe had seen invasions before. Vikings had come from the sea. Magyars had raided from the plains. Nomadic tribes had crossed the eastern frontier for centuries. They struck, looted, and vanished. Eventually they were defeated or absorbed. But the force now approaching Hungary was unlike any enemy Europe had encountered. It was not a migrating tribe. It was an empire moving with terrifying precision. The Mongols had already shattered kingdoms larger than Hungary. Northern China had collapsed beneath their campaigns. The Khwarezmian Empire, once dominant across Central Asia, had been systematically destroyed city by city. Russian principalities had fallen one after another beneath armies that seemed to move faster than news itself. Behind the destruction stood a military machine forged by decades of relentless conquest under Genghis Khan and perfected by the commanders who survived him. They understood movement better than any army on earth. They understood fear even better. By 1241, the Western campaign was commanded by Subutai, perhaps the most capable strategist of the 13th century. He was already old by the standards of the brutal frontier world that had shaped him, but experience had only sharpened him. For decades he had studied enemies across thousands of miles of terrain. Mountains, rivers, deserts, forests, all became pieces of operational calculation. Subutai did not think in terms of battles alone. He thought in terms of collapse. Entire societies could be dismantled if panic spread faster than resistance. The invasion of Europe was not a reckless charge into the unknown. It was a coordinated military operation executed across enormous distances with astonishing discipline. Separate Mongol armies moved like independent hunting packs while remaining strategically connected. Poland, Galicia, and Hungary were attacked simultaneously, preventing Christian rulers from concentrating their forces. The campaign itself already revealed the core principle of Mongol warfare: isolation first, destruction second. In April, a Mongol force annihilated a coalition army at the Battle of Legnica. European knights died in dense clusters beneath clouds of arrows and coordinated cavalry maneuvers they barely understood. The defeat shocked Poland, but its larger purpose was strategic. It prevented northern armies from reinforcing Hungary. The true target lay farther south. The Kingdom of Hungary stood directly across the Mongols' western path. It was wealthy, politically important, and geographically exposed. The Hungarian plain offered ideal terrain for mounted warfare, vast open ground where cavalry could maneuver freely. But Hungary also suffered from dangerous internal tensions long before the Mongols arrived. King Bela IV of Hungary ruled a kingdom weakened by aristocratic division and mistrust among its elites. Noble factions resisted royal authority. Military obligations were inconsistent. Coordination between magnates remained fragile even during crisis. And then came the Cumans. The Cumans were a nomadic Turkic people fleeing westward from Mongol expansion. Thousands entered Hungary seeking refuge under Bela's protection. The king accepted them partly from humanitarian necessity, but also from military calculation. He hoped their cavalry traditions could strengthen Hungary against the coming invasion. Instead, their arrival deepened instability. Hungarian nobles distrusted the Cumans immediately. Cultural differences widened hostility. Rumors spread that they were spies or collaborators for the Mongols. Tensions inside Hungary intensified at the exact moment unity became essential. Subutai understood all of this. The Mongols always studied political fractures before campaigns began. Merchants, scouts, diplomats, and spies carried information across enormous networks. By the time Mongol armies crossed into Hungary, they likely possessed clearer knowledge of Hungarian weaknesses than many Hungarian lords themselves. Meanwhile, Europe still misunderstood the scale of the threat. Many rulers believed the Mongols were simply another Eastern raiding force that would eventually retreat. The Holy Roman Empire remained politically fragmented. Coordination between kingdoms was slow. Messages traveled by horse across dangerous roads, while Mongol armies crossed entire regions with disciplined speed. Time itself favored the invaders. Inside Hungary, refugees flooded westward carrying stories of annihilation. Villages emptied before Mongol scouts even appeared. Fear spread unevenly across the countryside. Some nobles fortified castles. Others delayed mobilization. Many still underestimated the enemy. Then the frontier collapsed. The Mongols crossed the Carpathians through multiple passes simultaneously. Hungarian defenses disintegrated under the pressure. Local resistance was bypassed or destroyed with shocking efficiency. Smoke columns marked the path of invasion. Entire settlements vanished in days. The Mongol advance did not resemble conventional European warfare. There were no prolonged sieges at first, no ceremonial declarations, no slow movement of heavy feudal armies. Only speed. Mounted archers appeared without warning, attacked from multiple directions, then disappeared before defenders could organize pursuit. Communication between Hungarian forces deteriorated almost immediately. Roads became crowded with refugees, livestock, broken wagons, and panicked survivors. Every movement fed confusion. Subutai's campaigns relied heavily on psychological erosion. The Mongols understood that frightened armies became slow armies. Slow armies became vulnerable armies. The Hungarians now faced a crisis unfolding faster than their command structure could absorb. King Bela attempted to gather a centralized force near the Danube. Noble contingents arrived gradually from different regions, often with varying equipment, discipline, and readiness. Some knights came heavily armored for direct shock combat. Others brought infantry levies poorly suited for mobile warfare on the plains. No unified doctrine connected them. The Hungarian army reflected the structure of feudal Europe itself, brave, heavily armed in parts, but fragmented in organization. The Mongols represented something else entirely. A professional war machine shaped by constant campaigning. Each Mongol cavalryman could ride multiple horses, allowing operational endurance European armies could barely comprehend. Communication across units relied on banners, horns, drums, and disciplined tactical signaling. Feigned retreats, encirclements, and coordinated maneuver warfare were practice methods, not battlefield improvisations. Most European armies still viewed battle as a contest of direct confrontation. The Mongols viewed battle as controlled disintegration. As Mongol pressure increased, tension inside Hungary exploded into violence. Suspicion toward the Cumans reached a breaking point. In the chaos, the Cuman leader Khitan was murdered by Hungarian nobles who believed him to be collaborating with the invaders. The consequences were catastrophic. The Cumans abandoned Hungary in fury, riding southward while devastating parts of the countryside as they left. Villages burned. Supply lines collapsed further. One of Hungary's few sources of mobile cavalry support disappeared precisely when it was needed most. Bela lost both military strength and political control at the same moment. The kingdom was now internally fractured, strategically exposed, and facing perhaps the most sophisticated invading force of the medieval world. Still, the king chose to stand and fight. Near the Sujer River, east of the village of Mohi, the Hungarian army established a massive camp fortified with wagons. The position reflected traditional European assumptions about battle. If the Mongols attacked directly, heavy cavalry and fortified defensive lines might hold long enough to crush them in close combat. But Subutai had no intention of fighting on European terms. As the two armies maneuvered across the Hungarian plain, Mongol scouts observed every movement around the Sujer crossings. They studied the terrain carefully, the bridges, the marshes, the riverbanks, the movement patterns inside the Hungarian camp. The Mongols were not merely searching for weakness. They were constructing a battlefield, and somewhere beyond the darkness of the eastern plain, beneath banners moving silently through cold spring winds, Subutai was already preparing the operation that would destroy one of the largest armies Europe had assembled against him. The Hungarian commanders still believed the river protected them. By dawn, they would begin to understand that the river had become a trap. The Hungarian camp near Mohi stretched across the plain like a temporary city. Thousands of tents crowded together behind defensive wagon lines. Horses, supply carts, infantry formations, noble retinues, priests, servants, and armed retainers filled the enclosed space with constant movement and noise. Fires burned through the cold nights of early April. Armorers repaired damaged equipment beneath torchlight, while messengers rode anxiously between commanders attempting to impose order on an army assembled in haste. King Bela IV of Hungary had gathered one of the largest forces available to any Central European ruler at the time. but size concealed deeper weaknesses. The army was not a unified professional institution. It was a coalition assembled under feudal obligation, regional loyalty, and emergency necessity. Hungarian nobles commanded their own retainers with varying degrees of discipline. Foreign volunteers and church contingents joined the host with separate chains of authority. Communication between formations remained uneven even before battle began. Many still disagreed about how the Mongols should be fought. Some advocated aggressive cavalry action before the invaders could fully deploy. Others urged caution and defensive positioning near the river. Reports arriving from scouts were contradictory, fragmented, and often delayed. Mongol cavalry patrols constantly disrupted reconnaissance beyond the Hungarian perimeter. No one possessed a clear picture of the enemy's true disposition. That uncertainty alone created pressure inside the command structure. Meanwhile, the Mongols moved with deliberate calm. Across the Saja River, the army commanded by Batu Khan and directed strategically by Subutai prepared for one of the most sophisticated battlefield operations of the medieval period. The Mongol force was likely much smaller than the Hungarian host. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers dramatically, but even conservative estimates suggest the Hungarians outnumbered them significantly. Yet numerical inferiority had rarely troubled Mongol commanders before. They relied on coordination, mobility, timing, and battlefield control. The Mongol army itself functioned with remarkable structural discipline. Units were organized through decimal systems refined over decades of conquest. Commanders understood not only their own objectives but the broader operational design around them. Orders could be transmitted rapidly across moving formations through visual and auditory signals. Most importantly, Mongol soldiers were accustomed to confusion. European armies often collapsed once battlefields became chaotic because local commanders lost communication with one another. Mongol units trained and campaigned constantly under fluid conditions. They expected rapid maneuver, sudden redeployment, and tactical adaptation. That difference would become decisive at Mohi. The Saji River initially appeared to favor the Hungarians. A major bridge near the camp formed the most obvious crossing point, and Hungarian forces established guards there to prevent surprise attack. If the Mongols attempted a frontal crossing under pressure, they could potentially be trapped against the riverbanks and destroyed. At least, that was the assumption inside the Hungarian camp. Subutai intended to exploit precisely that expectation. During the night of April 10th into April 11th, 1241, the Mongols began their operation in multiple coordinated stages. One force under Batu Khan advanced toward the bridge directly, creating the impression of a conventional assault. At the same time, another Mongol contingent searched for alternative crossings farther south. Subutai himself reportedly supervised efforts to construct a temporary bridge across the river under darkness. The battlefield was already dividing into separate layers of action, while most Hungarian commanders remained focused on the main crossing. Before dawn, the first clashes erupted near the bridge. Hungarian defenders initially performed well. The bridge was narrow, restricting Mongol mobility and forcing attackers into concentrated space. Crossbowmen and armored troops inflicted significant casualties during the opening engagement. Some accounts describe the Mongols being driven back temporarily under heavy resistance. Inside the Hungarian camp, confidence rose quickly. For a brief moment, it appeared the invaders could be stopped. But the engagement at the bridge was never the entire battle. It was only the visible part. As the Hungarians concentrated attention on the frontal assault, Mongol forces continued maneuvering elsewhere along the river. Subutai's southern crossing operation advanced steadily through darkness and confusion. By dawn, Mongol cavalry units were already beginning to cross in locations the Hungarians had failed to secure adequately. The river line was slowly unraveling. Then the Mongols introduced another element European armies rarely encountered with such coordination: concentrated projectile disruption. Mongol forces deployed stone-throwing siege engines and heavy missile fire against defenders near the bridge. The psychological effect mattered as much as the physical damage. Noise, smoke, impact, and continuous arrow volleys destabilized formations attempting to hold narrow defensive positions. Under this pressure, the bridge defense began to weaken. Once Mongol cavalry established footholds across the river, momentum shifted rapidly. Units crossing farther south threatened the Hungarian flank, while Batu's forces renewed attacks at the main bridge. Defenders now faced pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Confusion spread through the Hungarian lines. Medieval armies depended heavily on local visibility. Once dust, smoke, darkness, and fragmented reports obscured the battlefield, commanders struggled to understand events beyond their immediate surroundings. Orders arrived late or contradicted previous instructions. Units reacted independently based on partial information. The Mongols exploited this perfectly. Rather than driving immediately into a single dense collision, they expanded operational pressure across the battlefield. Mounted archers moved continuously, striking exposed groups before withdrawing. Arrows rained into compressed Hungarian formations inside increasingly restricted maneuver space. The Hungarian army still possessed terrifying close-range power. Heavy cavalry charges could devastate enemies in direct contact. Armored knights and retainers fought fiercely wherever engagement became localized. But the Mongols controlled distance. That control changed everything. Horse archers avoided static confrontation whenever possible. They attacked the edges of formations, isolated smaller groups, and forced repeated repositioning. Hungarian cavalry attempting pursuit often found themselves drawn away from supporting units into zones where Mongol mobility became overwhelming. The battle gradually transformed from organized resistance into fragmented reaction. Inside the camp, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The wagon fortifications that initially offered security now trapped enormous numbers of soldiers, horses, and civilians inside a tightening space. Retreat routes became congested. Panic traveled faster than reliable information. Some units believed the river crossings had collapsed completely. Others thought the Mongols were already surrounding the camp from all directions. In many medieval battles, morale collapsed not because every soldier was defeated physically, but because enough men became convinced defeat was inevitable. The Mongols understood this deeply. They created pressure not only against bodies, but against perception itself. As daylight spread fully across the plain, the scale of the encirclement became increasingly visible. Mongol cavalry formations appeared around multiple sectors of the Hungarian position. Arrows fell continuously into dense concentrations of troops and animals. Fires began spreading in parts of the camp. Noise overwhelmed command. Horns, screaming horses, clergy shouting prayers, officers attempting to regroup scattered formations, wounded men crawling beneath wagons while mounted archers circled beyond effective counterattack range. The battlefield no longer resembled the controlled defensive position Bela had intended. It had become compression without coordination, and still, the Hungarians continued fighting. Many noble contingents launched repeated attacks against Mongol positions, attempting to break the encirclement before it closed entirely. Some achieved temporary success in brutal close combat. European heavy cavalry remained formidable whenever they could maintain formation and momentum. But Mongol battlefield management repeatedly dissolved those advantages. Feigned withdrawals opened gaps. Cavalry units repositioned constantly. Arrows exhausted men and horses before decisive engagements even occurred. Once formations fragmented, Mongol mobility allowed attacks against isolated pockets from multiple angles. Subutai's operational design now revealed itself completely. The Hungarians had been fixed in place near the river, compressed into defensive density, psychologically destabilized through multi-directional assault, then gradually enveloped as battlefield coherence collapsed. This was not an accidental victory emerging from chaotic combat. It was controlled destruction. Some Hungarian commanders recognized the danger too late and urged breakout attempts westward. Escape remained possible in certain sectors because the Mongols intentionally left parts of the encirclement less heavily sealed. This too reflected Mongol method. A completely trapped enemy often fought with desperate cohesion. A partially open escape route encouraged panic, fragmentation, and uncontrolled flight. Soldiers fleeing individually or in small groups became easier to destroy across open terrain. The illusion of escape accelerated collapse. By late morning, large sections of the Hungarian army were disintegrating into retreat. Units abandoned coordinated defense as survival instinct overtook command structure. Wagon lines broke apart under pressure from within as much as from outside. Then the slaughter began across the plain beyond the camp. Mongol cavalry surged into fleeing formations with devastating speed. Exhausted infantry and heavily armored knights struggled to maneuver effectively once cohesion vanished. Horses, trapped among wrecked wagons and bodies, created further obstruction. Men attempting to reach the river encountered chaos at crossing points already overwhelmed with panic. The Sajia itself became deadly. Some drowned attempting escape through marshy banks and crowded crossings. Others were ridden down before reaching safety. Small groups tried forming defensive circles in open ground, only to be isolated and overwhelmed beneath continuous missile fire. King Bela himself narrowly escaped the disaster. His survival required abandoning the battlefield entirely as the kingdom's army collapsed around him. By afternoon, organized Hungarian resistance had effectively ceased. Across the field near Mohi, tens of thousands lay dead or scattered in flight. The largest military force Hungary could assemble had been systematically broken in a single catastrophic engagement. And for the Mongols, the victory was not merely tactical. It opened the heart of Europe. By the time the fighting at Mohi subsided, the Hungarian army was no longer an organized force in any meaningful sense. What remained on the plain near the Saja River were scattered survivors, abandoned equipment, burning wagons, and the silent aftermath of a battlefield that had shifted from structured resistance into total fragmentation. The scale of destruction was not immediately grasped by every participant in the Mongol army. In medieval warfare, even decisive victories could take hours or days to fully reveal their strategic consequences. But at Mohi, the outcome was already unmistakable. The Kingdom of Hungary had suffered the collapse of its main field army. King Bela of Hungary fled westward under constant threat of pursuit. His escape was not a retreat in the organized sense, but a continuous movement through collapsing territory. Royal authority, already strained before the battle, now disintegrated as news of defeat, spread faster than any attempt to stabilize remaining defenses. Castles, towns, and fortified settlements across Hungary suddenly faced an enemy that had already proven capable of destroying its largest army in open battle. Panic replaced coordination. The Mongols did not pause to consolidate in the European sense. Instead, they transitioned immediately into a systematic campaign of expansion, moving along established operational patterns that had been refined across decades of conquest under Subutai. The logic was consistent. After the destruction of field resistance, the next phase was the dismantling of political and administrative structures. With Bela's army gone, Hungary's remaining defenses were fragmented into isolated strongpoints. Fortified towns and stone castles offered resistance in some regions, but these positions lacked the ability to coordinate with one another. Relief forces no longer existed. Communication between strongholds became unreliable as Mongol cavalry dominated open terrain. The countryside itself turned into a strategic weapon for the invaders. Supply routes were severed. Agricultural production was disrupted. Refugee flows overwhelmed urban centers. Fear became self-reinforcing. Each new report of destruction triggered further abandonment of settlements, which in turn accelerated economic and logistical collapse. The Mongols rarely needed to besiege every target immediately. Instead, they created conditions where resistance became increasingly unsustainable. This phase of the invasion demonstrated a central characteristic of Mongol warfare that distinguished it from most medieval European conflicts. It was not limited to battlefield victory. It extended into systemic disruption of an entire political entity. In the months following Mohi, Mongol forces advanced across Hungary in multiple columns, striking at towns and fortified positions while avoiding unnecessary delay. Where resistance was weak, destruction was swift. Where resistance was stronger, pressure was maintained through encirclement and attrition, rather than costly frontal assault. Cities such as Pest suffered catastrophic devastation. Entire regions were depopulated as inhabitants fled into forests, marshes, and mountains in an attempt to escape mounted raiders who could traverse open terrain far faster than any displaced population. The speed of Mongol operations created a psychological condition that European societies struggled to comprehend at the time. Defeat was not localized. It was continuous. Even areas far from direct engagement experienced collapse through fear alone. Economic life contracted rapidly. Trade routes became unsafe. Agricultural cycles were disrupted by displacement and destruction. The administrative framework of the kingdom struggled to maintain basic coherence. Yet despite this overwhelming success, the Mongol advance was not infinite. Strategic geography, logistical limits, and broader imperial priorities eventually shaped the campaign's trajectory. News of leadership transitions, within the wider Mongol Empire required attention elsewhere. Large-scale European occupation was not immediately sustained at the same intensity as earlier campaigns in Asia. Still, the damage inflicted during this period was profound. Hungary had been transformed from a centralized medieval kingdom into a fragmented landscape struggling to reconstitute authority. The human cost was immense, though exact figures remain impossible to determine with precision. Chroniclers of the time often exaggerated or generalized, but modern historical analysis agrees that population loss in certain regions was severe, compounded by famine, displacement, and secondary violence following the invasion. The legacy of Mohi, however, extends beyond destruction alone. It revealed fundamental truths about medieval warfare that European elites were forced to confront in the decades that followed. First, numerical superiority did not guarantee safety against a mobile, coordinated, professionally organized cavalry army.